All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another JINSA webinar. I'm Blaise Mishtal, JINSA's Vice President for Policy. We're here to discuss what seems to be a rare moment of U.S. and Iranian agreement, which is the support for the current recently created new Iraqi government. And here to discuss whether, in fact, that is a good thing or a bad thing, or something that, in fact, Washington and Tehran should be in agreement on. I'm delighted to be joined by two of the foremost experts on everything Iraq that we have here in Washington. Michael Knights, who's the Chief Product Officer for Horizon Engage and has spent a long time tracking particularly Shia militias in Iraq, previously for the Washington Institute, and Joel Rayburn, a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, and previously the senior director for Iraq at the National Security Council, but also, I think importantly, the author of the U.S. Army's definitive two-volume history of the Iraq War, colonel in the U.S. Army, and someone who I think knows more about what has happened in Iraq in the last 25 years than anyone else. So, Michael and Joel, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Joel, maybe I could start with you. Iraq held parliamentary elections at the beginning of November of last year. And yet the prime minister was selected and the government was formed just 2 weeks or so ago. Uh, what was the process and why did it take 6 months to go from the election to government formation?
Well, good to be with you, Blaise, and also good to be with Mike. Uh, One of the reasons that it took so long is that it always takes so long. The Iraqi system is pretty clunky, and anyway, even as written in the Constitution, but all the constitutional timelines get thrown out the window because procedurally, what the Iraqis would do, they would elect a parliament. The parliament would be seated. Parliament would then elect a president of Iraq and a slate of vice presidents. And then the president would task the largest bloc in the parliament with nominating a prime minister. And then there'd be a certain amount of time for the prime minister designate to be able to form a cabinet, which then comes back to which comes back to the parliament for ratification. I should say, actually, I skipped the very first step, which is that the parliament, once it meets, has to elect a speaker. So there basically a president of the in Arabic parlance, there's a president of the parliament, a president of the republic, president of the country, and then a president of the government. So Iraq has to go through three elections. They have to have the election of the parliament and then three elections after that for the leadership. And the way things have emerged is politically, that's what's written. What's unwritten is that each of those three presidents is allocated to a different communal bloc within Iraq, so that the Speaker of Parliament has come to be designated for the Sunnis of Iraq, the Sunni political blocs. The President of Iraq has come to be allocated de facto for the Kurdish blocs, and the President of the Republic, or the Prime Minister, has come to be allocated for the Shia political blocs. Now, there's a fight then, there's a competition within each of those communal blocs for who's going to get those positions. And there's a protracted political battle for that, because each of those communal blocs are subdivided in different political groupings that are competing with one another, and there's shifting alliances. In reality, just as is the case in Lebanon, this is exactly the kind of consociational arrangement that's in Lebanon. It's just in Lebanon, it's written into the Constitution and the governing law. In Iraq, it's just de facto the practice, but it may as well be written in law. I mean, it's as firm a constitutional element as any, in the same way that the British Constitution is not really written down, but there is a very clear set of constitutional guidelines. That is what has happened in Iraq. It's a consociational arrangement. It would be very difficult for anybody to change that. And what it also means is, just as in Lebanon, none of the positions is agreed until they're all agreed. because it's all of the blocs are jockeying for their influence over each of the three positions. So the Shia political blocs will line up on one side or the other of who will be the president of the parliament among the Sunnis. All of them will line and so on. So the Shia and the Kurds will weigh in and have an impact on who will be which Sunni bloc gets the speakership of the parliament. The Sunnis and the Shia will weigh in on who gets to be which Kurdish bloc and nominee gets to be the president of the parliament, and then everyone weighs in on who gets to be the prime minister, who comes from the Shia blocs. That's why that is the arrangement, and that's why it would take very long, regardless of even if it were perfect wartime, prosperous conditions, and the whole region were in a state of stability. If you layer in that the Iraqi election took place at a time of regional conflict, and then there were outside powers also competing to influence the shape of the formation of the Iraqi government, then it slowed down even further. So that is why, I mean, it's a miracle that the Iraqis ever seat any government at all. But it certainly wasn't unusual that this one took as long as it did. Let me stop there because Mike probably has some thoughts as well. But that's the general backdrop.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So yeah, Mike, let me turn to you and maybe tell us a little bit about sort of the outcome of the elections and who the major players were in this process of jockeying for government formation.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you both, especially Joel, after all the times we've spent together looking at Iraq and being in Iraq. I mean, to add on to some of the things Joel said, and he literally wrote the book on Iraq after America, which is still a great read. I'd say this, first of all, it's a miracle they form a government, but it's a miracle that happens every time, right? So it's kind of something that they've got very used to doing. Even though they do stretch a lot of their constitutional, the kind of spirit of it, definitely. The spirit of it is stretched often. They are very focused on having elections roughly on time. And in this case, forming the government roughly on time. They took about the maximum time they could to do some of the stages of it. But you could see they were keen to keep it on track. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that, the Shia religious parties and militias who run the country gain enormous benefit from running it. And they don't want it to collapse into complete chaos. E.g., for instance, constitutional timeframes don't mean anything anymore when the prime minister can just stay in position as long as he likes. No, there's reasons why they try and keep things roughly on the train tracks, even if the train tracks are heading somewhere pretty bad ultimately. I don't tend to talk a lot about the Kurdish or the Sunni political groupings in Iraq because they're not the ones who are running Iraq. They're not the ones who are picking the prime minister, which is traditionally, as Joel said, a Shiite role. And they're not the ones who are ultimately running the most powerful posts in the country, such as finance, interior, the prime ministership itself, the intelligence agencies, the central bank and things like that typically. So the key parties within what we call the coordination framework, which is the pan-Shiite bloc in parliament that agrees who the prime minister is going to be. And they have a majority of the seats in parliament. So if they want to, they can pass pretty much anything if they work together. Those guys have split into a number of factions. And, even the Shiite part, which is about 60% of parliament, is split, at least 10 ways. So you can imagine this is a pizza. The entire Iraqi parliament is a pizza that has about 32 slices in it. And nobody's going to get much of a mouthful with 32 slices. It takes an awful lot of pulling people together into coalitions. They're very fragile. In this particular case, the reason why we got Ali al-Zaidi as the new prime minister of Iraq, a banker, a money changer, a businessman from a major southern tribe who everybody in the system has made money with at some point or the other, is because none of these coordination framework players could agree who would be prime minister. They all said, we want to say in who will be the prime minister designate, but nobody wanted to accept everybody else's compromise candidates that they were putting up, who are in fact the candidates they themselves had in their pockets. So in the end, out of pure inability to break the deadlock, they reached somewhat outside of themselves to a candidate who was not, as far as I can understand, and I look very deeply, connected to any individual party, not to former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who Donald Trump said cannot be the next Prime Minister of Iraq. He was no good last time, he can't do it again. Not to designated terrorists like Assad al-Haq, who have 26 seats in Parliament out of 329, one of the largest Shi'ite blocs. Not to Badr, that was formed by the Iranians, that has about 20 seats in Parliament, not yet sanctioned, but very, very close to the Revolutionary Guard, not close to former Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Sudani, who had 46 seats, but his bloc has already split into two pieces, and so they're both smaller factions now. None of them could push their compromise candidate forward. Instead, the Supreme Court judge of Iraq and a number of other factions said, let's see if this businessman can be somebody that we can all work with. And at the moment, that's what they went with. And the Gulf states embraced him mostly. The Jordanians embraced him. Ultimately, the US embraced him. And after that, the Iranians embraced him, and the Turks and the Pakistanis and others. So, the creation of this prime minister is a very important thing to understand. How a person comes to the throne in Iraq is the most important thing about them. Who put them there? What did they offer those parties? And in this case, it would appear that that prime minister has not necessarily offered any of the key Shiite parties anything in particular yet. He might have made certain assurances that some very negative outcomes from their perspective wouldn't happen, like complete removal of all the militias. He might have made some of those assurances to the Iranians too. But I think, let's say, the Gulf states and the US probably had more of a role in shaping the introduction of this prime minister designate than has been the case in the past. So in the past, the Iranians went first and we said, okay. This time, I think we went first and they said, okay. I don't know if Joel would agree with that at this stage.
Yeah, Joel, curious.
Yeah,
Curious for
I think that's right. I mean, there's been a pattern of all but really one. Well, let's see. I think I think every prime minister that's come out of the Shia blocs consensus since 2005 has gotten the mandate because they were viewed as non-threatening to the interests of the major Shia political blocs and to the Iranians, so every prime minister that's gone in since 2005, the other blocs have assumed that prime minister would essentially be under their either control or heavy influence, wouldn't have a mind of their own, wouldn't have an independent power base, wouldn't be able to make decisions without consensus support. Now, the only instance in which that wasn't, and that's been largely true for all but one, and that was Nouri al-Maliki, who was able to get into office and develop his own power base, organize in a very Stalin-esque way, and seize control of the government apparatus in an unprecedented way. And that's but also since Maliki's prime ministership ended, all the other parties have said, well, we don't want another Maliki. We can't have that. We need to make sure that whoever we choose can't do what Maliki did and consolidate power. So the blocs that wind up agreeing to the prime minister then will take all the steps possible to prevent the prime minister from consolidating enough control and power to be able to actually execute policies over their heads. And I think that is what they're banking on with al-Zaidi in this case. He's a bit of an unknown quantity. He's not a politician, so we haven't seen him in leadership, whether he will be able to consolidate the kind of power base and control that he would need in order to strike an independent policy line from the rest of the the Shia parties. It's somewhat unpredictable, I think, for those political blocs because he comes from the business community. He's the first person to come in from that community. Everyone else that's been prime minister of Iraq has come from the Shia Islamist political world, maybe with the possible exception of Mustafa Kadhimi. But Mustafa Kadhimi, of course, was in that milieu, in the opposition, in the pre-2003 opposition, galaxy of Shia blocs. So he was very well known to them. So it's a bit of a gamble by these other political blocs. Also, the fact that he is perceived as having, as Mike said, a very close relationship with the Supreme Court judge al-Zaidi, who's a very powerful figure in Iraqi politics, probably the most powerful figure in Shia politics for sure. I think that's what I would say to extend Mike's points.
Joel, maybe just sticking with you and staying with Maliki for a second. It did seem like in January there was talk that Maliki was going to be the prime minister candidate. And then, as Mike said, I guess President Trump shot that down or threatened to not waive sanctions on Iraq if they went through with the Maliki nomination. Was that actually a serious attempt to put Maliki back in power after that experience that you just described?
Yeah, that was a serious attempt by Maliki to put himself back in power. So I think what's happened since Maliki left office, he remains a very powerful leader of a very powerful bloc. Essentially, the state of law, which is kind of like it's Dawa Party plus within the Iraqi parliament. This is a big bloc, and he's the head of it, and so he has banked on being a kingmaker since he couldn't return after 2014 as prime minister. Then for the last 12 years, his influence has come from being one of the kingmakers. He's one of the people that had to agree to who would be the Shia premier, who would get the mandate from elsewhere in the Shia bloc. Now, what he would dearly, which is essentially how Mohammed Shia Sudani became prime minister. He was fully backed by Maliki, came from that state of law kind of coalition. Sudani, as soon as he got into office, then began trying to do what Maliki had done, which was to consolidate his own control and be independent. And it wasn't very long before Maliki and some of the other Shia political grandes who had put Sudani there said, well, when it comes to the next government, that guy for sure will not be returning over our dead bodies. So that was the immediate. But then Sudani won the largest electoral bloc and attempted to get the mandate for himself. But these other blocs, having already said over our dead bodies, then we're in a stiff arm wrestling match with him to deny him the mandate. The United States was de facto supporting Sudani for continuity's sake, and because Sudani had made commitments to the U.S. on curbing militia power and so on, and doing things to expand the U.S.-Iraq relationship, not just security relationship, but economic relationship in particular. But when it became clear that the other blocs were going to essentially block Sudani from returning, and the question went to, well, who then comes forward? At first, Maliki then thought of nominating someone else from within his bloc, and so there were some names floated on who that would be. But when things started aligning, I think Maliki then began saying, well, maybe this time I don't have to just be a kingmaker. I don't have to just send a proxy in to be prime minister, nominate a proxy to be prime minister. Maybe I can just do it myself. And he seemed to have Iranian support for that, and he seemed to have the support of some of the militias. And that got very far down the road, that idea, with the U.S. having a quiet opposition to it, but Maliki not really getting the message, or not believing the messages that he was getting, which tended to be diplomatic and nuanced and not very straightforward until it had to go all the way basically to the Oval Office for President Trump to clarify the U.S. position and say, over our dead bodies, will that guy return as prime minister? And then that ended his candidacy. At that point, Prime Minister Soudani then first tried to come back in to get himself the mandate again. And then as that was still essentially checkmated by the other Shia blocs, then it became a competition of proxies. Maliki then put forward a candidate from his bloc. Prime Minister Soudani then countered with his chief of staff, so that essentially each of them vying to be kingmakers. The Shia parties deadlocked between those two, and then that threw the way open for an outside candidate going off the board, and fake Zaidan came in and some others came in and supported al-Zaidi. That was the Shia political bargaining and positioning that went on. Now, during this entire process, the United States was weighing in and Iran was weighing in, but just among the Shia parties, that's essentially what happened. Maliki and Soudani canceled each other out, and then that left the way open for the outside candidate, which was al-Zaidi, almost by default. But I think the rest of the parties, though, what they will be hoping for is to have the same kind of arrangement with al-Zaidi as they've had with previous prime ministers, is to say, all right, we will agree to your mandate as long as you agree to the following laundry list of things that will render you not a threat to our bloc's interests. And the Iranians will have done the same thing.
So, Mike, how should we think of Zaidi? I mean, you said that there's not much known about him. He doesn't have sort of a political background. Does that mean he's a political blank slate? Do we think he has an agenda or an ideology? How much is he likely to be controlled by the various factions that put him in power versus be independent? What should we expect from him?
I'll let Mike. Yeah, Mike's done a lot of research on this, so I'll let him go first on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Well, look, anyone who's owned a bank in Iraq and in the world is not a blank slate. The US Treasury knows him very well. So do, for instance, US grain importers, because he's one of the biggest, he is the biggest aggregator of foreign grain coming into Iraq, and a lot of that is American. So, whether it's our business community, whether it's our banking regulators, whether it's our intelligence community, we know Ali al-Zaidi a bit better than it might appear, I think. He's somebody whose own bank was, for instance, banned on US instructions from the Iraqi dollar auction, their way of, getting dollars into the hands of Iraqis, in theory, who need them to cover import costs. But in actuality, the way that the militias divert a lot of dollars to Iran. So he's had to have those negotiations with the US government about how to fix his bank, how to work with US law firms, regulators, lobbyists to fix that. And so in some ways, there's more track record there for the US than some people might think. He's a relatively gentle person. In other words, he's quite well mannered. He's not a political fighter. He's a businessman who always tries to come to some arrangement with people. He has worked with pretty much every key faction in Iraq in the kind of banking, money exchange, to put it politely, way. And as a result, he's somebody that they've all found to be workable, and the US has as well. So in many ways, he's a guy with no overwhelming black marks on him, which is difficult to find in Iraq. Whether he's a guy who, as Joel pointed out, has any experience running large bureaucracies? No. Does he have any experience having to look someone in the eye and tell them, do what I say, or, you're going to prison? No, he doesn't really. I'm sure Iraq is a place where business is tough. It's hard-edged. But at the same time, he's not one of the more hard-edged businessmen. And so, he's entering a world now, and you can see it sometimes on his face in the photos, where he he knows he's in, I won't say over his head, but right up to his nose. And, he's just about staying above water. Now, the good thing is, I don't think Zaidi is a standalone individual. He has no team of his own. He's going to get the team that's given to him by political factions and also by the judiciary and by the military and intelligence services. And the strength of that team and where they help him to lean or pull him to will be what really tells us what kind of government we're going to get with Zaidi. We've had good men run Iraq, I think, like Mustafa Kadhimi, Prime Minister from a few years ago, but they were not necessarily hard enough to do the things required to break the power of militias and corruption networks. We've had bad men run Iraq, like Nouri al-Maliki, I would say, and a couple of others, Mohammed Shia Sudani, and they did not everything they did was wrong. So, it's really about how you came to the throne, and that's encouraging this time. He was not picked by Iran, which is rare in Iraq. And then it's what kind of team you build around you. And that's up in the air still, but it's getting slightly encouraging. We're seeing, particularly in the intelligence and security realm, individuals getting rotated out who are very bad news and are very tight with the Iranians or with the militias or both. And we're seeing other people rolled in who might not be quite that way. So I'm mildly hopeful. When you say how should we view Zaidi, the Prime Minister, I think we should very much view him as an opportunity. And I'm happy to discuss a little bit more depth why the moment right now is so potentially transformative for Iraq if the US leans into supporting this Prime Minister, but also disciplines him and the broader system if they fail to do the things they need to do to get Iraq back on the right track.
That is definitely something I want to dig into, but let me get Joel's take on Zaidi and how we should understand him.
I think my take largely accords with Mike's. Coming from the business community, he's had to maintain business relationships with all of these political blocs and not make enemies. So I don't think he has enemies right now, which just sets him apart from probably all the other candidates that were out there. And he'll have a bit of a honeymoon period. He'll have a bit of a honeymoon period with the United States as well. But each one of these blocs and the United States and the Iranians have a set of very firm expectations for him to deliver on. And he's going to have to make some choices because some of the expectations are mutually exclusive to one another. He's not going to be able to satisfy everybody. And as Mike pointed out, he's going to have to be administering a state and a vast one. The Iraqi state is enormous. Its military, its security apparatuses are vast, but so is, the ministries of Iraq are gargantuan, and he's going to have to be running them. And there's a budget. My goodness, to come into the seat at a time because the Iraqi government budget is so bloated, it's so large, and the state provides so many services and has so many people on the payroll, so many Iraqis on the payroll. The break-even point for oil has to be very high, and that's if you're exporting it. Well, the Iraqis aren't exporting oil very well right now because the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It hurts them just about more than anybody else because their alternatives are quite meager. So he's going to be coming into office at a time when they're going to be at a big cash flow deficit, and he's immediately going to have a budgetary crisis that he's going to have to negotiate with. And guess what? If you're cutting down different parts, if you're having to cut back on the budgetary expenditures, the political economy is so thick in Iraq that he's immediately going to have to be negotiating, strong arming, cajoling different political blocs, which say, well, wait, not my share of the budget, not our share. Wait, that ministry, that's ours. That budget comes to us. Wait, or that governorate, and so on. So it's going to be tough. he's in an even more difficult, I think probably the most difficult, most challenging environment confronting any new prime minister, probably since Hyder Abadi walked into office at a time when ISIS owned a third of Iraq. I mean, can you imagine? So, but it's certainly the toughest. It's the toughest task of any new premier since then.
Joel, if I could just ask you to expound on that a little bit, because you said he's going to be pulled in multiple directions by competing interest groups or factions. And so I wanted to ask you to tell us a little more about the sort of the issues facing Iraq that he's going to have to confront or be pulled on. You talked about the economic challenge with the closure of the strait. What are sort of other areas in which there's going to be pressure on him to move one way or the other?
I think the biggest one, the biggest one is that the revenues, government revenues, for a decade and more, because it's vast oil production and export and revenues, along with and gas, and for quite some time, an increasing portion of the government's oil revenues have been diverted or been siphoned off by political blocs in Iraq, and it's reduced the share that the government writ large is able to use to finance itself. So if he's going to balance the budget, he's going to keep the state functioning, he's going to have to claw some of that back. Which political bloc which of the political blocs does he claw it back from? How, which actors, and so on. That's the first minefield in which he has to walk. He also then the other part of the budget, the functioning of the state, is the payroll. It is vast and hyperinflated and full of non-actually working people. So ghost employees, ghost soldiers, ghost policemen, and so on. All the political blocs get a share of the budget of this ministry or that security service or this government and so on by having a quota, a portion, a share of people on the payroll. He's going to have to reduce and rationalize that. Every prime minister who's come into office in the last 10 years has tried to grapple with that and reduce the payroll or expand it and reduce it in one area and expand it in another based on the politics of it. But every prime minister has come in and said, my God, we cannot support this payroll. We can't keep millions of people on the government payroll. It's got to be reduced. That's huge. That's a huge share of the political largesse. And he certainly in a time of constrained resources, which is going to be for quite a while in Iraq, then he's going to have to fight that. But I'd say those are the two biggest ones: are the oil, the energy sector, the revenues from the energy sector, and then and then third, I think, is what do you do with the budget? What do you do with the government money? The Iraqi state contracts for everything under the sun all across Iraq, and so there's a huge political competition to get the contracts. So it's the revenues from the energy sector, it's the payroll, and then it's which of the political blocs gets this or that contract. If he really wants a functioning state and a state that has viable finances, he's got to get those under wraps, and those are very, very difficult. They're also all interconnected.
All right, Mike, I'm eager to hear why you think this is a potentially hopeful moment, and how the United States can make the most of it.
Yeah. So, look, in the past, when Iraqi prime ministers have come in, I've traditionally had a moment of hope with them. Sudani was a bit of an exception. I didn't like how that started. I understood better what kind of audition process he went through to get the job with the Iranians. Likewise, with one of the ones before him, Adel Abdul Mahdi. I feel more hopeful in this case for a couple of reasons. The big breakthrough moment for me in understanding Iraq and its governments is this idea that it's how a man comes to the prime ministership that matters. it really sets the tone for what follows. It's hard to break out of a very subordinate relationship with the Iranians and with Iraqi Shia militias, who are in many cases US designated terrorists. If that's the position you've started from, I think this guy starts from a slightly different position, which is that other forces, except the Shia militias, have had a role in picking this guy. One of them is Judge Faik Zaidan, the Supreme Court judge in Iraq. One is probably Thomas Barak, the US super envoy for the Middle East. And I think some of the people behind Zaidi are people who care quite a lot about what the Gulf states think, the Emiratis, the Saudis, and others. And put those three things together with this current moment, you have a very particular opportunity. The US has just demonstrated, for all of its hemming and hawing about Hormuz, that it's pretty serious about the threat posed by the Iraqi militias. It said, we don't want Nouri al-Maliki as a prime minister. He said, we don't want Iraqi militias and terrorist leaders in the cabinet. And that's held until this moment. We have said, and then during the war, we have mounted more strikes on the Iraqi militias than we ever have at any stage, right back to when we were physically in the country pre-2011. And even then further back, I mean, this is like 2008 level of striking that we've been doing in this last war against Iraqi militias, firing at both the US and at the Gulf states and at Israel from Iraq. So, we've demonstrated that we're pretty annoyed with these militias, and that against the backdrop of everything that's happened with Iran, everything that's happened this year, everything that's happened with Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah and the Houthis in the previous couple of years, these groups are recognized as being a dangerous enemy. And in this war, they've been more dangerous than they've been at any point in the past. Why do I say that? In the past, Lebanese Hezbollah was the heavy lifter for the Iranian regime in terms of its external proxy rocket and missile force. Then the Houthis took over for a while. In this war, it's been the Iraqis. They're the ones who have received the most up-to-date missile, rocket, drone systems. They're the ones who have done the most attacks on the Gulf states and on US forces. And these guys, if we look, we just saw Mohammed Bakr al-Sadi, one of the members of key Iraqi militia, seized by the US in Turkey, brought back to the US because of terrorist attacks he was planning against the continental US, North America, and had already planned in places like Europe and the UK. So these guys were going international and even threatening key US leaders and their family members. All these things mean that the Iraqi militias are somewhat in the spotlight right at this exact moment that the Iraqi government is taking shape. There are moves in the country you can see where the people who want to reduce the power of the militias are starting to move chess pieces on the ground because they may feel that they have US and Gulf support ultimately. I think this is this is an opportunity, but it's also a moment that we could easily flub. And how do we flub this moment? The only real risk right at this exact second is that the US government's Middle East policy community is out to lunch on Iraq. And wouldn't necessarily blame them for being out to lunch on a country like Iraq. They got Iran, they got Israel, Lebanon, they've got Gulf states, they got all sorts of things going on. But I'll just say this, Iraq is not a small place, as Joel said. It's not Lebanon. It's 7 times the population, it's 7 times the income. It's one of the largest oil producers in the world, top 5. But also, more importantly, with the amount of effort it would take to push Iraq in the right direction, if you applied that same amount of effort to Iran, you wouldn't get a result. You wouldn't get that result with Israel, Lebanon, probably. You wouldn't change fundamentally your relationship with the Gulf states. Iraq's a place where, with 1 unit of effort in how its prime minister acts, what actions they take against militias, whether they let any militiamen into the cabinet ultimately, we can actually put the place on quite a different track potentially, or at least put their foot on the path to a new track. And that for me says efficiency-wise, that's something the US might want to put some effort into right now because it's a fleeting opportunity and it's a place where you can actually achieve a lot more bang for the buck diplomatically. Um, that's my feeling for why this is a moment of quite significant opportunity.
All right. Well, I have a couple more questions for both of you, but wanted to also open it up to the audience. So if you do have any questions for Mike or Joel, feel free to submit them using the Q&A function in Zoom, and then I'll read them out. But for now, Mike, let me stay with you. You mentioned the role of the Gulf states in helping choose Zaidi, and also the attacks of the militias on the Gulf states. We've also had the Gulf states, according to reporting, the Emirates and Saudi striking those Iraqi militias that have been attacking them inside of Iraq. Does that create either new interest from Gulf states or new leverage from the Gulf states that can also be brought to bear to try to limit the strength of the militias inside of Iraq, or is it principally still going to fall on the United States to try to break that stranglehold?
I don't think the Gulf states can alter the situation in Iraq on their own, but what they are signaling is they're very, very upset with the number of attacks that have come out of Iraq during this war, especially considering the fact that, the Gulf states at the start of this war did not base US forces, were not involved as an offensive partner, but were attacked anyway. And when it comes to being attacked from Iraq, they're not being attacked by Iran across the Gulf. They're being attacked by an Arab neighbor next door that also has no part in the war. So it's kind of doubly offensive from them. Iraq is also a place where the Gulf states can strike back in a way that sends a signal to Iran and to pro-Iranian elements in Iraq, but doesn't have quite the same risk attached to it as attacking mainland Iran, which it appears at least the Emirates have done even during this war. But in this next phase, as we're into a sort of ceasefire, a weak ceasefire, messy ceasefire in the Gulf to some extent, it's a lot easier to do cross-border stuff into Iraq. And the Iran-backed groups have found that they can get away with firing stuff into the Gulf from Iraq in a way that perhaps direct attacks out of Iran would have been more difficult to accept and might have affected the ceasefire or brought a US response. So I think the proxy war involving and the Gulf is going to get more interesting. It's not that the Gulf states played a role in picking Zaidi. It's that a businessman like Zaidi, who's a true international businessman, not just some militia front company who has to do most of their business in the shadows, basically a respectable businessman like Zaidi understands that you cannot get on the wrong side of the US and the Gulf states if you want to be connected to the global financial system and if you want to have a chance of fixing some of the stuff wrong with Iraq's economy, which is a state killer. The way the economy is structured, the overdependence on oil, the massive deficit every year, the fact that the oil prices could go low and then double or triple that deficit at some point in the future, all of these things mean the survival of Iraq as a modern industrialized nation requires international support, including connection to the global financial system and the US and the Gulf states. So what it means is we've actually got some people inside the system now in Iraq who are not looking narrowly, saying, I will never go on vacation in Europe. I will never openly have a bank account or a business in Europe because I'm an Iraqi militiaman that's been sanctioned by the US or might be. No, this is the people who actually want to be a part of the world saying we should not upset the Gulf states in this manner. We should at the very least stop attacking them and maybe bring some of those people to justice or at least disempower them in a way that the Gulf states can recognize. So that would be some comments on the Gulf side of this.
Thanks, Mike. Joel, let me turn to you and get your thoughts on what the U.S. could be doing to try to positively influence the situation in Iraq, to try to strengthen Prime Minister al-Zaidi and get a good outcome here, in particular when it comes to trying to sideline the militias.
Well, first, just to extend Mike's point, in the same way that the Lebanese government eventually had no choice but to declare its opposition and for all of the non-Hezbollah aligned political blocs basically to band together and say we cannot tolerate a state within a state threat to our neighbor when our neighbor is capable of and willing to defend itself by striking Lebanon. The Iraqi government faces something very similar now, because in the past, it's just been a one-way street. Basically at the direction of Iran, the Iraqi Shia militants have been attacking the Gulf countries without any response other than what the United States would do on behalf of the Gulf states. But in this war, with the Saudis and Emiratis both reportedly and others being willing to at least support those kind of direct strikes into Iraq, the Zaidi and his government now face the prospect that they have to come to the same point, and they probably already have, to say we cannot tolerate a state within a state threat that's going to provoke a war with our neighbors when our neighbors are militarily pretty capable. Both the Emirates and the Saudis have air forces that are quite potent, that the Iraqis can't match, and that would be very quickly be very damaging for Iraq. Iraq can't win that war, especially, and Iraq also can't afford, as Mike said, Iraq can't afford to be not, let alone at war. I mean, they can't afford just to be politically at odds with the Gulf. They need access to the Emirates for their fuel, for their oil and derivative exports, and for their finances. They need access to Qatari capital and Qatari support. They need that kind of investment from the Saudis as well in their energy sector. They really can't. They're not going to be able to grow without that. They also need to be able to they need a constructive relationship with Turkey. The other thing I'd say about this current crisis is that another thing that's hitting home to the Iraqi government, and this is a place where the United States really can play a constructive role, is that the Iraqis have let the Iranians and their proxies inside Iraq veto the development of all alternatives for Iraqi oil exports other than the Strait of Hormuz. And the promise always from the Iranians, first of all, if the oil needs to flow south in order for the Iranians and their proxies to siphon it off and to parasitically draw from it. And so pipelines to the west, pipelines to the north, all those kind of infrastructure projects, so on. The Iraqis or the Iranians have used their influence to prevent the Iraqi government from doing. This crisis now shows even, I think, some of the Shia Islamist parties that means death for Iraq. If they have no alternative, if it comes down to a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, it means it's an existential problem. So even those parties in Baghdad that are pretty Tehran aligned know we can't put all our eggs in the Iranian basket here. So I think you're going to see Iraq really developing these alternatives. The Iraq-Turkey pipeline, which already exists, but which is underutilized. An energy export channel through Syria, through Jordan, and so on. Maybe even in conjunction with Kuwait, which doesn't have any other outlet of its own. You know, you could see that kind of thing. And that's where the United States can help both economically and politically sort of broker these kind of the political economy of these kind of alternative projects. I would say, you know, if I were advising the U.S. government, that'd be one of the things that I would focus on. In addition to, of course, the United States, we're now in a position where we are allies of Iraq, we're allies of the Gulf. We cannot have a war among our allies. So not just for our own purposes, but for the interests of all our allies, we've got to insist and maintain a very hard line about diminishing and really trying to remove altogether militia influence in the government and in the Iraqi economy. After which, beyond that, they'll wither on the vine if they don't have a place in the government and they can't participate on a large scale in the economy. So we have an interest in that, not just for ourselves, but also in the interests of our allies. I think it's those two things. Keep pushing on the militia presence and involvement and their revenue stream, and then help to broker these alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz for Iraq and its other neighbors.
All right. Well, to wrap up, I wanted to ask both of you sort of what you're going to be watching for in the coming weeks or months as early indicators of how this government in Iraq is going. Whether in fact it is a hopeful moment, as Mike said, or whether it's sort of Iraq returning to previous patterns. But Joel, let me stay with you. What are you going to be watching?
Well, so keep a watch on, will the United States be able to continue its hard line on no militia presence in the government, and then if you wind up having militia frontmen or someone sort of infiltrate in here and there, will the U.S. have the will to take action about that? Secondly, will the Secretary Bessent and Treasury have started to take actions against facilitators of militia revenue streams, especially in oil, in the energy sector in Iraq? Will that continue? Is that just sort of a flash in the pan that's connected with the confrontation with Tehran? And then if the confrontation winds up getting resolved, does that mean an end to that concerted treasury? It's economic fury, which Secretary Bessent has done as the economic pressure analog to epic fury. That's a lot of the focus there has been on Iraq. Will that focus stay in place after the military confrontation with Iran dissipates, if it does? So I think those are the two things to keep an eye on.
Thanks, Joel. Mike, what about you? What are you going to be looking out for to judge how things are going?
Yeah, once we get into June, after the Eid, religious period in Iraq, we'll start to get answers to some of our key questions. We'll get the cabinet finished off, as Joel said, in Iraq, and we'll see if they manage to hold the line on no militia presence in the cabinet. I think that one of the things I'm going to be watching for, we'll see a couple of efforts to pull the wool over the US eyes. There'll be an initiative in June where a number of militias say, oh, look, we're handing out off our weapons to the state and there's no problem anymore, right? You can delist us as terrorist groups or you can not list us in the future. And now we are good to join the cabinet, right? And, the US at that moment either is going to get suckered or it's going to know what it's doing. And that's a key moment, I think, because they think they can do cosmetic disarmament and we won't notice. And that's going to be a very important one. The other thing is we're going to see where Zaidi goes on his first foreign visit. In the past, often the earliest foreign visits of a new prime minister have included Iran. Let's see if this one does. I think not. I think he's going to go west, he's going to go south, and he's going to go west. He's going to go to the Gulf and he's going to try and come to the US. But the fact is, even if you've got a blank sheet and, we're trying to encourage you, we need to see some things done before you get admitted to a White House visit or a Mar-a-Lago visit. So again, I want the US to stay tuned in. I think one of the key indicators for me is how many times Thomas Barak visits Iraq, has high-level interactions with Iraqi leaders, and how much I sense he's paying attention to the details, because the devil is in the detail on all this stuff. And if he's dialed in, and if he's taking action against the right Iraqi leaders and watching the right indicators rather than fake ones, then we'll be okay. This moment, we can take advantage of it.
Well, Mike, Joel, it's very clear that both of you are paying attention to the details and very much appreciate you sharing them with us. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you to everyone who tuned in from the audience. Have a good afternoon and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you.